Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we are going to break down my strategy on how to find bass on new bodies of water. We're actually out on a lake I've never been to before. I have a tournament here next weekend, and we're going to teach you a little bit about how I break down a new lake and try and find some bass along the way. This strategy has worked for me on numerous different bodies of water, whether there's information available on the place or not. This lake specifically does not have really any information available. I couldn't even find a YouTube video on how to fish this place specifically during this time of year. However, this has also worked for me in ponds whenever I fish a new pond I've never been to. It's worked for me on different bodies of water as I've traveled to different tournaments across the country. So this strategy will help you find bass whenever you're visiting a new body of water or going to a place you haven't been to in a while, or just trying to find bass in general. If you've been catching them and you can't find them anymore, this is typically how I go about breaking down a body of water. So stay tuned and let's get right into it. So there's two things I do before I ever even head to the body of water to start fishing these places. The first thing, you kind of just have to know this stuff, and if you'd like to see a video on how to break it down, I will do that as well. You have to know your seasonal bass patterns, what these fish like to do during different times of year. You don't have to have it completely memorized and know everything there is to know about how bass move. If everyone knew that, they'd be amazing at fishing because they'd be very easy to find. That's one of the biggest tricks in finding bass on new bodies of water, is knowing how these fish like to move, how they move throughout the times of year. If you can get the basics down on seasonal bass movement, you're going to be a lot better off in understanding at least where to start on these bodies of water. Instead of just going to a body of water, this lake's 5,000 acres, I could have shown up here and said, wow, there's 5,000 acres of lake to fish. Knowing that I know seasonal bass patterns, I know that these fish aren't going to be way offshore. I also know that these fish probably aren't going to be way back in the shallows here. I just came back here to get out of the wind. Right now, we're in the fall transition. It's September, so I know these fish are either going to be on the first points leading back into creeks, just outside the creeks on the main lake on any type of cover they can be out there, or small little drop-offs on deeper water, or they're going to be on the first, like, third, maybe half of the creek. That's about it. So I can narrow down a lot of the water just by that. I can literally say, okay, the bass should only be in this area. That's not saying they will only be in that area. There are times that the bass could be all the way back in the shallows here, and there could be a really good spot that there's loaded with bass. But if you're just looking to find fish quick, that's the easiest way to do it, is to know exactly where these fish should be at this time of year and not waste time fishing stuff where they shouldn't be this time of year. Unless it's a lake you go to over and over and over again, then you can expand on some of these other types of areas. But today, I know that we're going to be focusing just around the points on those mouths of the creeks. Those fish are going to start their transition back into the shallows here, but they're not back here yet. Especially, bringing me into my next point, is studying the lake and the maps before you come here. So this lake is a flood control lake, so they raise and lower the water level as the seasons progress to allow for water influx, or to be able to drain water out if they need to prepare for a flood. So in the fall, like right now, what they do is they actually drain the water really low. That way, when spring rain and snow melt comes, the water can fill up and it doesn't overflow its banks too far. It can also hold the water back from going into some major rivers and flooding downstream of this lake. So that's why they bring it down. Well, they've already started to bring this lake down. It's about 3.5 foot low already. That being said, again, fish probably aren't going to be in the shallows back here because there's not much for them to be in anymore. These lily pads are very shallow. They're only about a foot deep. Any of the wood that's back here that they typically could live on is only in about that deep of water. So a lot of these fish can't even get into this cover. That also means that if there is a piece of cover that has that much water on it, they most likely will be on that piece of cover. So that's another key piece of information we can take with us to find these bass out here, whether it's isolated pieces of cover that still have enough water on it, or those main lake points where these fish are going to drain out from here, work their way out to the main lake, and set up there. As fall transition comes, the shad are going to start migrating to the backs of the creeks. The bass that are in the backs of the creeks, if they're resident fish or main lake fish, will be coming to those main lake points. Most likely, that's where most of the activity is going to be. So just knowing those few things, I can break down those types of areas right there. And the next thing would be to actually study the lake map, if there is one, or you can go on Google Earth or anything like that. I spent last night out here on Google Earth looking at this lake when it was drained down to see what kind of areas exist. I can find where those deeper logs might be, because they'll still be in the water rather than lying on dry land on Google Earth. The other thing you can do is look at a navionics map. If you're not fishing a pond or something like that and the lake actually has a navionics map, you can go on there and find these main lake points that these fish will be on, or you can even find areas where there's a cut in the bank and there'll be some deeper water next to the bank there for those fish to actually lay on those pieces of cover, pieces of wood, whatever there could be there. You can see those contour lines where it's really, really steep and make an educated guess that there should be some cover there with some deeper water for those fish to be in. So utilizing all that, we were able to find some areas today to actually go check out. I marked them all on my map and said, these are the areas I want to take a look at. Narrowed down that lake a ton before I ever even made it out on the water, and picked a few select areas to go focus on rather than try all over the lake and figure out where these fish are at. That's the way I like to break down a lake. I try to pick very specific areas. I'll try to narrow down as much of the lake as I can and get to an area where I can really focus on and pick it apart to try and pattern the fish and then expand the pattern to the whole lake once I figure out some type of pattern. So then we can finally head to the lake and see if we can catch a bass. So this is all preparation that I do before I ever head to the lake. I do it usually the night before, week before, whatever, when I'm planning to go to a new lake. Now we're actually going to get to the lake. So what I did today, I pulled up to the boat ramp and I took a look at the lake before I did anything. I backed my boat in the water and just kind of looked around and saw what I could see with my eyes. I could see we had really clear water. I could see bluegills and shad swimming around the dock. So I know those are the two main forage types. Since I've never been here, I don't actually know what the forage is. I know bluegill and shad are the types of forage that those fish are feeding on. And I know with the clear water, I can kind of get an idea of my lure selection as well. And then lastly, the big key that I found, which I was not expecting coming to this lake, there is a lot of grass. I thought this was going to be a lot of wood, a lot of rock, and being able to fish offshore, crankbaits, stuff like that. Showing up to the lake, I realized there's a ton of grass everywhere. There's milfoil, there's hydrilla, there's lily pads, there's eelgrass. There's a lot of grass in this lake that I didn't know about, and we have clear water. So the next tip I can give you is after you analyze what the lake looks like and kind of break down what your lure selection should be, I kind of keep it simple. I narrow it down as much as I could. So I have about 5 rods here that I've been playing around with. Really haven't played with much else, because what I'll do is I'll jump from area to area to area that I had marked on that map and pick it apart with these couple baits, rather than stick 20 rods out there with a bunch of different baits, a Nico rig, a this, a that, a whatever, and have all this kind of stuff on and try a bunch of different baits. Usually if you find an area where the fish live, they'll eat something you have tied on if you keep it pretty simple. So the basics that I have on for today, my cleanup bait and something that I can flip around to any of those isolated piece of cover. I have just a Texas rig in a green pumpkin color, water's clear, and I know they're feeding on bluegills, so I picked that one as one of my main ones. The next one that I had picked as a cleanup bait as well is a Wacky Rig, and I have this in like a baby bass color. Again, water's really clear, they're feeding on bluegills or shad, that's a perfect one as well. On some of those isolated offshore spots, I'm fishing some main lake points. I'm trying to graph a little bit and see if those fish are still offshore, if they haven't made their way shallow yet. I'm just using a drop shot out there on those stumps. If I can find a stump, I'm dragging a drop shot through it, because I might not catch the biggest fish off that stump, but if I don't get bit on a drop shot dragging it through an offshore stump that I had marked on my side scan, I don't feel confident that there's a fish there anyway, because they would eat a drop shot, even if it's a 12-incher all the way up to a 12-pounder, not that there would be in this lake. If there's a fish on a stump out there, it's going to eat a drop shot if I drag it through. So I know that I only need that bait to cover some of those offshore places. And then lastly, I have some shad baits, and these are the ones that I've been covering water with. These are the ones I've been using the most to make sure that I can cover more water and hit a lot of these spots and really narrow down what water is not effective, what water has fish in it. So I have a spinnerbait and a top water, and I'm just covering a bunch of water with this. I'm throwing the spinnerbait along the grass edges and working it down into the grass a little bit, and then earlier this morning I was throwing this 6 Sense Dogma here over the top of the grass edge, and we actually did get a couple bites on this already. But being able to fish baits fast like this and cover a bunch of water allows me to learn where these productive areas are and where I don't need to spend as much time. I could go back to the places that I caught fish on with this top water earlier today and probably try some of these other baits that I didn't stop and fish. I caught the fish and just kept moving to see what I could find. find as many spots as you can, and then I can go back and break them down. I could go back and throw a Nico rig there if I wanted to, or I could go back and throw the drop shot on the grass edge. I can do whatever I want on those areas, knowing that there's a reason that those fish were there. They're not just there to be random most of the time. Sometimes you can just catch a random fish, it'll throw you off, but most likely that fish was there for a reason. Couple fish were there for a reason. So they were in kind of the same area, so it might have been a pattern that I was working towards. So that's the way I try to figure out some of these places and how I like to break them down. So now let's head out on the water, see if we can piece this all together and find us a bass to catch on one of these baits right here. And just like that, we were able to find us a little hard spot on the outside of a point. There's some grass right here, and then there's a pocket right back there. Whether the fish pulled out or whether they're moving in, this is a great area for fish to gang up. We were able to get him on the drop shot right there. This is actually a really nice fish for this lake. Usually takes like 10 pounds a day to win, so catching one that's 1.5 pounds, almost 2 pounds, that's a pretty good bass for here. Hopefully we can catch a couple more, and if you enjoyed today's video, want to see what baits you should be throwing through the month of September, go ahead and check this video out right here. Leave a like down below and make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any more of my fishing videos coming up. Thanks for watching.